The rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield of Officer Daniel Hayes's patrol car, blurring the fading light of a late October afternoon in Maplewood. The small town, nestled in the heart of Ohio, was typically a haven of quiet streets and familiar faces, where everyone knew each other's names and troubles. But tonight, the storm cast a restless edge over the town, the wind howling through the trees and the rain drumming a tense rhythm. Dan, a 20-year veteran of the Maplewood Police Department, felt the weight of the day in his bones. The damp cold seeped through his uniform, despite the heater blasting full force. At 45, with salt and pepper hair and a face etched with lines from years of service, he was counting the hours until the end of his shift, dreaming of a hot meal in the silence of his modest home on the edge of town. As he turned onto Main Street, his radio crackled to life, cutting through the monotony of the rain. Unit 12, possible domestic disturbance at 123 Elm Avenue. Caller is a 3-year-old male. Proceed with caution. Dan's brow furrowed. A 3-year-old. It had to be a prank, a child playing with a phone, or perhaps a miscommunication. Yet the dispatcher's voice carried a note of unease, a subtle urgency that pricked at Dan's instincts. In his 2 decades on the force, he'd seen it all: bar fights, domestic disputes, lost pets, but a call from a toddler was a first. He'd learned never to dismiss a call, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Children, he knew, could stumble into situations far beyond their understanding. He flipped on his siren, the wail slicing through the storm as he sped toward Elm Avenue. Elm Avenue was a quiet, tree-lined street, its single-family homes neatly maintained, their porches adorned with pumpkins and autumn wreaths. Number 123 was a small white bungalow, its paint peeling slightly, the front yard cluttered with an overturned tricycle and a rusty swing set swaying in the wind. The neglected flower bed hinted at better days, and Dan felt a pang of apprehension as he stepped out of his car, the rain soaking him instantly. His boots splashed through puddles as he approached the front door, his hand resting lightly on his holster. From inside, he heard muffled sounds, a soft whimper, a faint sob, and a rhythmic thump that sent a chill down his spine. He knocked firmly, his voice steady but warm. "Maplewood Police. Open the door, please." Silence followed, broken only by the rain's relentless patter. Then, a small, trembling voice whispered, "Who is it?" Dan crouched to the level of the doorknob, his tone softening. "It's Officer Dan from the police. Can you open the door for me, buddy?" The lock clicked, and the door creaked open a few inches. A pair of wide, tear-filled blue eyes peered out, belonging to a boy no older than 3. His tousled blonde hair was plastered to his forehead, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one eye missing. "Are you hurt?" Dan asked gently, scanning the boy for injuries. The boy shook his head, his lower lip quivering. "No, but Grandpa fell down. He won't wake up." Dan's heart lurched. This was no prank. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the dimly lit living room. An elderly man lay sprawled on the floor, unmoving, his frail body surrounded by a pool of dark crimson seeping into the worn carpet. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wool and a faint metallic tang that churned Dan's stomach. He rushed to the man's side, recognizing him as Robert Miller, a widower known in town for his quiet demeanor and devotion to his grandson. Robert's breathing was shallow, his pulse weak and thready. A gash on his forehead suggested he'd hit the coffee table in a fall. Dan grabbed his radio, his voice urgent. "Officer needs assistance at 123 Elm Avenue. Unconscious male, head injury. Request immediate medical backup." The boy, still clutching his teddy bear, watched from the corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Is Grandpa gonna be okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Dan forced a reassuring smile, though his gut twisted with worry. "We're gonna take good care of him, kiddo. You did the right thing calling us." As paramedics stormed in, their movements swift and precise, Dan guided the boy to a worn sofa, shielding him from the chaotic scene. He noticed a landline phone on a nearby table, its receiver dangling off the hook. "Did you call the police?" Dan asked, crouching to the boy's level. The boy nodded, a flicker of pride breaking through his fear. "Mommy taught me. She said if something bad happens, call and say my address and my name. I'm Liam." Dan was floored. This child, barely old enough to form full sentences, had the presence of mind to dial 911 and relay critical information. "You're a brave kid, Liam," he said, his voice thick with admiration. "You did a great job." Liam sniffled, wiping his nose with his pajama sleeve, leaving a smear of dirt. "I just wanted to help Grandpa," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Robert, Dan learned more about Liam's situation. The boy lived with his grandfather while his parents, Michael and Sarah Miller, were away on an extended business trip overseas. Robert, in his late 70s, had a history of heart problems and had recently complained of dizziness. It seemed he'd fainted, striking his head on the way down. Liam's call had likely saved his life. At the hospital, Robert was conscious but groggy, his condition stable but serious. Dan sat with Liam in the waiting room, the boy curled up against him, clutching his teddy bear. "You're a hero, Liam," Dan said softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "You saved your grandpa's life." Robert, when he was able to speak, confirmed the story. "He's a good boy," he said weakly, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Smart, like his mother. I don't know what I'd do without him." But as Dan listened, a nagging concern grew. Robert's declining health and Liam's young age painted a troubling picture. The elderly man struggled to keep up with an energetic toddler, and Liam's parents were thousands of miles away, their work demanding constant travel. Dan couldn't shake the image of Liam alone in that house, dialing 911 with trembling hands. Was this family dynamic sustainable? Was Liam safe? Back at the station, Dan confided in his captain, Laura Bennett, a seasoned officer with a reputation for wisdom and compassion. "It's a gray area, Dan," she said, leaning back in her chair. "You've got a good heart and sharp instincts. If you think this child is at risk, you have a duty to act. The system's not perfect, but it's there to protect kids like Liam." With Laura's support, Dan contacted Child Protective Services, detailing his observations, Robert's frailty, Liam's vulnerability, and an earlier incident Liam had mentioned in passing, trying to help by cooking, nearly setting the kitchen on fire. Dan emphasized that the family wasn't neglectful, just stretched thin, but the situation posed risks. The next day, a social worker named Emily Carter visited Robert and Liam at the hospital. Dan waited anxiously for an update, torn between relief at having acted and guilt over potentially disrupting the family. When Emily called, her tone was reassuring. "We're providing support services," she said. "Home health care for Mr. Miller, childcare options for Liam, and counseling for the family. The Millers are committed to making changes." Dan exhaled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He'd done the right thing, but the bond he'd formed with Liam lingered. Over the next few weeks, he found himself drawn back to Elm Avenue, stopping by after shifts with groceries or a small toy for Liam. He learned the boy loved dinosaurs and superheroes, his eyes lighting up at the sight of a plastic T-Rex or a Superman comic. Dan, who'd never married or had children, discovered a surprising joy in these visits. He taught Liam to throw a baseball in the backyard, built blanket forts in the living room, and read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that sent Liam into fits of giggles. Liam, in turn, adored Dan. He'd race to the door, his face beaming, shouting, "Officer Dan." The boy's enthusiasm was a balm to Dan's soul, a stark contrast to the grim realities of his job: traffic accidents, domestic disputes, petty thefts. With Liam, he felt needed, not just as a cop but as a person. One rainy afternoon, Dan noticed a framed photo on the Millers' mantel, a younger Robert, beaming with pride, holding a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket. "Is that you, Liam?" Dan asked. Liam nodded. "Grandpa said I was a tiny baby and cried a lot." Dan studied the photo, seeing the love in Robert's eyes, a love mirrored in Liam's when he spoke of his grandfather. Despite the challenges, this was a family bound by deep affection, a bond that transcended distance and circumstance. As Robert's health improved, Dan became a fixture in their lives. He fixed leaky faucets, mowed the overgrown lawn, and shared meals of Sarah's casseroles, sent frozen from abroad. He took Liam to the park, pushing him on swings until the boy's laughter echoed through the air. He bandaged scraped knees, soothed nightmares, and listened to Robert's worries about his health and Liam's future. But duty called. A string of jewelry store robberies in nearby Riverton pulled Dan into a weeks-long investigation. He worked grueling hours, chasing leads and interviewing suspects, his visits to Elm Avenue dwindling to phone calls filled with apologies. Liam's voice, small but cheerful, always forgave him. "Come back soon, Officer Dan," he'd say. When the case finally broke, Dan drove straight to Elm Avenue, exhausted but eager to see Liam and Robert. He found them playing checkers by the window, Liam's face lighting up as he ran to hug Dan. "You came back," the boy shouted, wrapping his arms around Dan's legs. Dan hugged him back, warmth chasing away his weariness. "Couldn't stay away, buddy." Weeks later, Liam's parents returned. Dan, unsure of how they'd react to his involvement, kept his distance, focusing on work. But the emptiness gnawed at him. Liam's laughter, Robert's quiet gratitude, the sense of belonging he'd found in their home. One afternoon, the dispatcher called. "Officer Hayes, a Mr. and Mrs. Miller are at the station. They're asking for you." Dan's heart raced as he drove to the station, bracing for confrontation. Instead, he found Michael and Sarah Miller waiting with gratitude in their eyes. Sarah held a bouquet of flowers, her face etched with emotion. "We can't thank you enough for looking after Liam and my father," she said, her voice trembling. "He calls you his hero." Michael shook Dan's hand firmly. "We were so focused on our careers, we didn't see how much Liam needed us. Your report to CPS was a wake-up call." They explained their plan to prioritize family, reducing travel and enrolling Liam in daycare. Dan offered his support, not as an officer but as a friend. As he left the station, he felt a sense of closure. He'd helped a family find their way back to each other. Dan continued visiting Elm Avenue, becoming an honorary uncle to Liam. He watched the boy grow, marveling at his curiosity and resilience. Inspired by Liam, Dan began volunteering with at-risk youth, finding purpose in mentoring others. His bond with the Millers transformed him, teaching him that true strength lay in empathy and connection. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Robert, watching Liam chase fireflies, Dan felt a profound contentment. "I never thought I'd find a family like this," he said softly. Robert smiled. "Sometimes life surprises you with unexpected love." Dan nodded, his heart full. A single call in the rain had changed his life, giving him a purpose he'd never imagined, a family, a home, a love that healed his heart.